Hello, hello, hello. Welcome everybody to CBR MTG's deck series webinar. I have been thinking about doing something like this for quite some time. I see I have 25 frames per second, which is a very high frames per second. It's almost 30. Good enough for, something bad. But otherwise, pretty happy with everything. Welcome, Diamond Dude, welcome. Santiago. How is everything? How is everyone today? We will just give a couple of minutes so people can come in and get settled, and then we can get right into it. So, welcome everyone. This presentation on deck philosophy is called Reimagining the Patrick Chapin Archetype Wheel in 2021. Welcome, Uncle Meat. Excellent. That's so good to hear, Diamond Dude. I'm very happy to hear that. I'll go through the spiel while we're doing our thing. So we have a YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/CBRMTG. We have a Twitch channel. If you're watching right now, you are on it. That is twitch.tv/CBRMTG. Of course, we have a Twitter. That's twitter.com/CBRMTG. And we have a Discord as well by the same name, but you can join it if you would like. If you don't know anything about 7 Point Highlander, you can message. You can go !7ph, and it will take you straight there to the website. There's also a website, a Discord for 7 Point Highlander. It's where we plan most of our stuff. So good time to join that as well. Otherwise, I think that's about it. There's not much else to say except welcome. This is deck philosophy. If you've never heard of deck philosophy before, you're in for a fantastic treat. If you have, of course, you will know that it's the idea that your deck should be built a specific way so that it's the best that it can be. You know, your deck should be really succinct, and it should be all driven towards the same idea. And if your deck is sort of confused about what it's going to do, whether or not it's an aggro deck or a control deck, or you can't find the middle ground, you can end up putting cards in that might not necessarily make your deck the best that it can be. And hopefully after this, you'll get an idea about how I and how the 7 Point Highlander community, through consultation, has created this archetype wheel. And through it, you'll be able to get a better understanding about what deck philosophy is and why you should actually think about it, because that is really important. So without further ado, let's begin. I have a few memes, so only a couple though. So let's go to the next slide. Wonderful. Wow, what a year 2020 was. I did this presentation originally last year, but last year we had some terrible things happen. Bushfires, the big Rona, and more Magic cards were printed, which I'm sure a lot of people were very upset about. But one thing that stayed the same was deck philosophy. We didn't get into it at all last year. We were in our bunkers, we were protecting ourselves from bushfires and COVID. We didn't have enough time to actually think about what it means to be a deck builder. Today, 2021, fantastic year, all upside. And I think this is the perfect year that we have a look at deck philosophy. And so with community consultation, over the course of 2 peer reviews, so one where I made it, and then we took some feedback, came back, did it again, took some feedback, came back again. So it was actually quite a fair bit of feedback, and I have no doubt that that there will still be a lot of contention around some of these choices. But this is what this is for. This is the presentation. If you have any questions or something, please put it in the comments. We will work through it as we go through. It's quite a long presentation, but we'll go through each archetype, and I'm sure there will be no contention about whether or not any of this is true. So in 2014, as a lot of people know, the Patrick Chapin wheel was developed as part of a novel called Next Level Deck Building. Patrick Chapin made this wheel that you see on the left. It's split into 4 quadrants. It's very much the same as the one on the right, which is the one that we've been working on since. And I'm not going to lie, It was started as the Patrick Chapin wheel, and I wanted to sort of reinvent it, which is why it's called Reimagining. I'm reinventing the wheel, so to speak. So as you see on the left is the Patrick Chapin wheel, and as you see on the right is the 7-Point Highlander community archetype wheel, which is a great name, rolls right off the tongue. Excellent. I'm so glad to hear that, Diamond Dude. Yeah, it makes a huge difference if you're actually into deck building as a concept. It's like there's a whole thing about it as well that people called neck deckers don't necessarily get, but it's just another facet of Magic that a lot of people enjoy. Welcome, Slowloke. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Happy to have you here. You came just in time. You see there's some big changes here. So one of the big changes we have is that we changed the left and the right quadrants. Hopefully you can see it well enough, but on the left side it's been changed from unfair to fair, because I actually think that unfair and fair. Welcome, Frank, as well. Oh, the whole gang is here. That's very sweet. I'm very happy to have you all here. On the left side we have changed it from unfair as a subjective term. I determine what's fair, and that might be different to what you determine is fair. So I think that was a good idea to change it between synergy and value, because I believe that the more effort that you put into your cards working together, the less effort you can put into your cards being powerful in a vacuum, which we've heard a lot before. So I'll start from the left. The little blurb that I put against it is synergy. My cards have to work together to achieve a goal, and that happens in contrast to value, where each of my cards are individually powerful and my deck is efficient. This all comes down to top decks. You see in a lot of mid-range and, you know, Modern Jund and Modern Mardu, where people talk about having good top decks. Like a Bloodbraid Elf is a great top deck, but say a Reanimate, when you don't have any creatures in the graveyard, is a bad top deck. So it kind of gives you an idea about what you're trying to do as a concept, because I believe that you won't be able to do both, and if you try to do both, you will tend to just like pull one away from the other or pull one. So you should be considering these two as kind of ropes, where you're pulling on one side. If you want to add more to resiliency or value, you're pulling away from synergy, because of course I could have 2 reanimation spells, or I could have a reanimation spell and a cantrip. So you see how those two kind of intersect, even though you're both working towards the same thing. Next is the top and the bottom, which went from aggressive to reactive. Just a good quality of life improvement. We just changed it to proactive and reactive. And that's the sort of idea of like, if you're sitting on cards in your hand and you're waiting for your opponent to do something, your deck is pretty likely a reactive deck. And if you are pushing, if you are the aggressor, as said in Patrick Chapin's wheel, of course, you don't necessarily have cards in your hand. Think about Zoo versus Control, where Zoo is happy to play a 1-drop on turn 1, 2 1-drops on turn 2, and so on and so forth. Whereas Blue-White Control, say, will have, you know, a Wrath in the hand, a counterspell, and all this stuff, and it's kind of waiting for you to make the decisions so that I can react to them. At the top, it says proactive. If my opponent doesn't interact with me, I will win. And reactive says, I want to stop my opponent from enacting their game plan for long enough for me to enact mine. That's not saying that reactive decks can't be proactive, and that's not saying that proactive decks can't be reactive. It just means what your what vibe you are putting across, I suppose, or how your deck is supposedly built, because you do want to be not split in between as much as you can possibly bear. Some things that changed as well is actually some of the placement of the decks on the list. So because some of the things, yeah, talking about deck vibes. So Diamond Dude says, I'll just quickly interject, I like the distinction between value and synergy because it really highlights the threat classification Patrick used, where every creature is either a Baneslayer that gives you value for staying, or a Muldrifter that gives you value for entering play. And I think that classification is outdated because it was before Jace TMS or Primeval Titan were printed. That is a really good point. And I really appreciate that, because actually a lot of control win cons, unlike Jace TMS, do kind of give you immediate value, so you don't necessarily lose a lot if it's removed by a Doomblade. Think Torrential Gearhulk, think Bolt, Snap, Bolt. You know, these are sort of things that entering the battlefield, it already did a lot, but if you've already locked up the game, those sorts of reactive win cons can kind of be anything. So going back to the presentation, I did change blue midrange and non-blue midrange. I think by virtue of you including blue in your deck, you're more likely to include cantrips and you're more likely to include counterspells, because that's a great reason to be in blue. So this is... I probably should come with a preface that says not all decks will exactly fit into this, especially in Highlander, because Highlander is it's the Brewers format, you know. It's every deck can be slightly different, and although we kind of fix to a lot of these archetypes in this wheel, it's not necessarily saying that all decks are going to be like this, because you can be a blue mid-range deck but have no counterspells and no cantrips, one of the ones we will go through. The Nathan Brewers format, exactly. But if you include a true name Nemesis, then, you know, you're being proactive and you are including a blue threat. Up the top, we swapped over the creature combo and creature synergy. Creature combo should probably be in combo. Creature synergy, I recognize, and we're going to go through this when we interview each one, essentially. But creature synergy is the idea that you can beat down with your creatures, whereas creature combo, as it says in the thing, like Boggles, Infect, Prowess, Devoted Druid combo, like, it's a lot harder to actually win with the creatures that you're putting on the battlefield. It's a combo deck, and you can beat down with a Kitchen Finks or a 1/2 Kiln Fiend, but it's not necessarily your main game plan, and things would have to go really right for you to win outside of that. Whereas creature synergy, I can beat you down with my Goblins, which we'll go through in a second, and I don't necessarily have to combo, which is a slight preference for Goblins as well, because they have gotten a lot of combo pieces lately. And of course as well, my apologies, we went through Prison and combo control as well. Prison, this is a tough one as well. I think about combo control as a deck that has creature synergy is, of course. The first one. Combo control to me is basically a control deck with a combo win con. And the more combo win cons you add, the actual more driven to synergy you are, because things could go wrong. You could draw a Deceiver Exarch when you're supposed to be drawing a counterspell, and these sorts of things as well. Yeah, exactly. And Diamond Dude really raised a fantastic point, is that they are right next to each other as well. And we will talk about the contention between the two being next to each other, because I believe that there is some contention between them as well. But it also comes from a 1D graph. In the future, perhaps this will be taken on, that it'll be created like a political compass, where you have 4 quadrants and you can kind of sit here, or here, or here, or here, or here. And then eventually like a 5D graph, where you have to talk about it over the course of, 20 years. Or multiple universes, I guess, is 5D. So without further ado, we should begin. And starting off with the very first one, and thank you for this fantastic graphic I found on Google Images. So please imagine that I'm standing in front of a wonderful whiteboard and I have my laser pointer in my hand. The first one that we're going to go through is creature synergy. So I want you to think about combo decks and neoform / birthing pod decks. Like, these decks, as I mentioned before, are decks that can win with creatures. And that shouldn't be understated. Fantastic. You'd love to win with creatures. But they're also pretty close to sort of comboing off. Like, if you think about birthing pod decks, and then the next example that we're going to do is Goblins, because I think it's a really fantastic view into what a good creature synergy deck is. But think about birthing pod decks as well, where you have great creatures, Siege Rhino maybe even, but you can also be I've seen lines of pod where you pod into Spellseeker, take an extra turn, you pod that into Kess, take an extra turn. Those are sort of combo-y things. Welcome, Jadosity. Welcome and subscribing. Thank you. Humans is a great example as well. Yeah, exactly. So these sorts of things where you have combo win cons, but it's not necessarily the main game plan. Main game plan is beating face. So the thing that I put in here, it says, my deck is based around creatures and therefore tend to be the aggressor, which is why you see it at the proactive side. Because you're putting creatures on the battlefield, you're advancing the board state, and you're working around with combat mass as well, which is really important. However, if things grind along, I can still win in the late game more so than a combo deck. And that's kind of the resiliency aspect that you have from just being a little bit to the right of the combo quadrant. Being in the value section, or sort of aggro, is that you can rebuild from a board wipe, and you can rebuild from combo hate pieces. It doesn't necessarily mean game over for you. So as a side note as well, most decks in this category can combo off, but it's not necessarily the main game plan. Diamond Dude says, I'm super into Penny Dreadful too, and I've been brewing non-stop with Heartless Summoning lately. Great card. Great card to cast Get Rogue Monster. And there has been a non-zero amount of games of one, which is beating with cantrip 1/1s, although the main plan is to just go off. That's a really fantastic point. So going into the next slide is Jund Goblins. Frank Karamarudis has been playing with this deck a lot in Canberra, really representing how strong it can be, winning a lot of events when he can. But also Luke Mulche and Tyrone Phillips as well. If you're in the sort of 7 Point Highlander community, been working really hard at sort of building this thing. So I might just move over to actually have a look at the Goblins deck, and you can kind of get an idea about where it sits on the map and like why it sits where it does sit on the map. So in this deck, 29 creatures, huge amount of creatures, and you'll find that the instance and the other cards that aren't either power out your creatures early, like your fast mana, or give you sort of card advantage with the Skull Clamp, or lock down the game with the Blood Moon. But also like these two, Once Upon a Time and Collected Company, they're actually instants that just help smooth the process along of putting down creatures. So your main game plan is to put creatures on the battlefield, which makes you the aggressor or the proactive deck. But you're put into the aggro quadrant because of that reason, but also you're sort of moving a little bit more towards value over synergy, because your goblins are also kind of just good and they generate value throughout the game. So you see here, you know, if you've never seen a goblins deck before, I'll quickly walk through it with you. You have your really cheap goblins that come down on turn 1, usually 1/1s, including Goblin Lackey, which is where you're sort of getting this goblin tribal synergy sort of thing, which is why it also sits kind of near the top as well, because goblins work really well as a synergy deck, but is also a value deck. So you kind of can see why it's sort of tithering on the point of between combo and aggro. And then also, as I mentioned before, some decks do just have the combo. Specifically, Goblins in this instance have been able to put in the new card. Is this not in the list? Oh no, yeah. Bogart Harbinger, Conspicuous Snoop, Kiki Jiki, and this is sort of like a 3-card combo. Schrodinger's Goblin, yeah. And so Frank will be able to attest, of course, in the chat that the deck is not a combo deck, but it's not really an aggro deck, but it's not really a control deck either. It kind of tithers on the point, and is kind of you're at the whim of what the top decks that you get about how you want to sort of pivot your way into a victory. Whether or not it's like you're stalling while you create the combo, or you're like controlling the board with cards like as well. Where are we? The Chain Whirler. And a card that's not here by the name of the bouncy one, the one that has a Man of War on the stick. Frank helped me out with that one for sure. But as you can see, this is like a deck that's not primarily trying to combo, but it does have a combo aspect in it. Sting Scourger, thank you very much, Lachlan. So moving back to our presentation now. So and that's goblins. So that's kind of what you think about creature synergy decks, where they sort of straddle the line between combo and aggro, you know, synergy and synergy and value, aggressive and non-aggressive. Sting Scourger, a little bit late, but that's perfectly fine. So moving on to the next one. Next one we have creature aggro. Think zoo decks, red-black aggro, and these are sort of decks that are less inclined to get incremental combo advantage, and this is what sort of separates a zoo deck from a goblin deck, because goblin has cards like Goblin Ringleader, Goblin Matron, Goblin Lackey. Like these cards actually combo because they are goblins, whereas zoo decks, they're all 2/3s for 1, or you know, they're primarily just ahead of the curve, trying to swarm the board with small creatures. You can think Affinity and Modern as well. These are sorts of creatures, these are sorts of decks that just, they are still as proactive as it gets. You know, they're still very proactive, but they're slowly moving towards the value side of the spectrum as opposed to synergy, because the synergy in a zoo deck is like, play a Curd Ape and have a forest on the battlefield, which is not necessarily that much of a synergy. So as it says on the side, my deck is also based around creatures, but not in a way that matters as much as if a specific one gets removed. 2 1-drops a turn, 2 1-drops on turn 1 is fine with me. Some small synergies, but that's just the icing on the cake of life. And coming back to the chat, Diamond Dude says, Modern Death Shadow is the weirdest archetype because it's technically between creature aggro and tempo, but it's definitely synergy-driven version of the archetype. Yeah, and we can have a look at that as well. Towards the end, we'll have like a section where we can kind of theorize together where it will sit on the wheel. So have a think about that and sort of come in towards the end, and we can sort of slot through it together. So let's go to the next one, which is Dylan Kikawa's Red-Black Aggro. And by the way, you can find all the decks if you type in !deck, and if you just go on Moxfield and filter search by Australian Highlander and hashtag RPCW, which is the Reimagining Patrick Chapin wheel, you'll be able to find all these 16 lists. So if you want to find that as well. So that's a tempo deck that can combo. So with Red-Black Aggro, it's no doubt an aggressive deck. You are right up the top of that proactive area, but you do have a little bit of synergy, you know, but you're starting to move towards value, where each card is like a burn spell, essentially, because, you know, my Rubber of the Rich, it doesn't really matter if you delete it, it's still going to do the damage. So looking at this, you can start to see that the creature synergy is starting to move away, where we have 23 creatures as opposed to 29, which is actually not an insignificant difference. But Red-Black Aggro has been in the format for quite some time, and that is because the cards still stay good. You know, Spike Jester is not doing anything fancy. It's just a 3-1 for 2 with haste, but it does what it does really well. And so as you move away from creatures, you start moving towards spells that kind of do the same thing. So why Red-Black Aggro is on this list is because we're actually starting to move towards having more sorceries and more instants. And you can tell with these sorceries and instants, it's kind of more just more burn spells. And then you have a couple of bits and bobs that, you know, help you sort of move through. But the idea is that you are moving more towards value because Lightning Strike does Lightning Strike things 100% of the time, unless it gets countered, and then you kind of don't really care because you have another Lightning Strike in the back burner, ready to go for the next one. So surely I can figure out an easier way to do this, but that's fine. Yeah, so as I mentioned before, Neiman Burn, made by a guy called Neiman very long time ago. Red-Black Aggro has been quite in the format, but pioneered by Dylan Kikawa in Canberra, and we should be very thankful for his work. So moving on to the next one, number 3, is Tempo. So Tempo is a really contentious archetype because it is aggressive and also has a lot of control elements. Jeremy Neiman, yeah, thank you very much. Built over leftwards from Dan Unwin's Cube. So that's some historical context in there for you. Fantastic. So Tempo is like a really contentious archetype. I think where I put it is good. You are moving towards value, but you're starting to become more reactive, is the way that I sort of think about it. It's still an aggro deck. You're still putting a Goblin guide on the battlefield and protecting it, but the idea of Tempo is that you're playing way less threats than aggro decks, but you're just trying to stick a good one and then keep it on the battlefield. So as it says in here, my deck is less based around creatures, but more so than a specific few. Their only synergy being that they are worth their low cost. Tarmogoyf and Delver ask that I make deck building considerations. So for Tarmogoyf to be good, you have to actually have spells in your deck. You can't necessarily protect the Queen, Delver, Daze spell, Pierce Force. Exactly, that's a perfect way to put it. So we're just sticking a Delver on turn 1 and then beating face while, you know, maybe I Mana Leak or Spell Pierce or Daze, like these sorts of things, like kind of push the tempo. So you're still being the proactive deck, but you're protecting yourself just a little bit more as you work your way through. And the deck that I've chosen for this one is actually Barb Tapley's 5-color Tribal Flame Zoo. Non-blue tempo decks. That's an interesting concept because blue really heavily helps in that aspect because blue has a lot of bounce spells, it has a lot of soft removal. Alicia, thank you for the follow. Appreciate you and everything that you do for the Magic community. But I would love to hear chat's idea of any other non-blue tempo decks. That's a really good point. I think blue really lends itself to tempo because you can like spend a mana on a cantrip, you can like attack with your Delver, and then you can also hold up some soft removal. I tend to put hand disruption not in the tempo slot because hand disruption can also kind of just suck, and it doesn't necessarily stop your Delver from being killed if your opponent has a Fatal Push and a K command. I think Sly can play as a tempo deck by utilizing the burn spells in order to pave the way. Yeah, just wondering if blue-based aggro is just a tempo short. Yeah, that's probably a good way to put it, tempo shorthand. But yeah, I think sort of pushing the idea of tempo in deck philosophy is that you're protecting the queen, but also you're pushing your advantage. So you start the game with an advantage by having a 3-2 on turn 1, or you have a 2-3 Tarmogoyf on turn 2, and it's just going to get bigger and bigger and bigger, or you land on a Clothos or something like that. Like that's why Rug Life is a really good example as well, because and I'm wondering how people feel about this choice that I made. Play your threats, then your time walks. Exactly. So I want to move over to Barb Tapley's list because this might also be somewhat contentious as well, because I mean, besides the fact that she called it Tribal Flame Zoo, which is also has had its share of arguments because it's not necessarily a zoo deck, but I think this is like a really good idea, a really good view of what a tempo deck can look like if you're trying to get away from maybe Rug Life, which is like a really contained, great example of a tempo deck in the Australian 7-point Highlander format. So looking at Barb's list, she has decks, she has threats that are fantastic. And once they stick, they are fantastic, you know. We see a lot of the stuff that we mentioned before, Tarmogoyf, Brazen Borrow, and Bone Crusher, like these are sort of things that like leak out value as they come, but they also are a significant threat. Hexdrinker is a great example of that as well. But then Barb sort of moved over into the sort of top-end-ish version where she's playing Glorybringer, Questing Beast, and then moving back down to the 3-drops as well. I think Zoo is maybe less of an archetype, was more of a vibe. I think that's fantastic. Hexdrinker into Abrupt Decay counts as a tempo start in my book. I think Teferi as well is one of the things that you can kind of consider where you're bouncing your opponent's blockers. I think if you find that yourself bouncing opponent's blockers, you're probably moving into that sort of tempo aspect where you can with Teferi, Time Raveler, and Brazen Borrower, of course. But then you see some sort of stuff in Barb's deck as well, where they're more moving towards value. The Chain Lightning is just a great card. Ponder and Preordain, they don't necessarily do anything by themselves, but they sort of fix up your draws as well, so that you're less, you have less dead draws. And then when you start to move your way away from proactive into reactive, you tend to find yourself adding a couple more cantrips because you need to smooth out your draws. The idea of cantrips, of course, from there was a fantastic thing that I wish I had written down. But the idea of cantrips is that you start to add them when your deck is becoming less value centric, because if you have a Jund deck, you don't need cantrips because every top deck is great and you don't need a brainstorm. But when you're starting to try to find specific things, that's when you start to add cantrips. So we see in Barb's deck, we have really soft permission, Daze, Spell Snares, Spell Pierce, probably Spell Snares hard permission as well, but kind of soft in the way that it's conditional. Conditional counterspells is probably a good way to put it as well. And then you have really cheap, efficient removal as well. So you can pave the way, so you can keep attacking with your V-Click, you can keep attacking with your Mantis Rider, and all these stuff push the boundary as well. Yep, fantastic, Diamond Dude. Yeah, absolutely. I think tempo is really about choking the amount of stuff your opponent can do with their mana while you have already established a board and you don't care that much about card advantage. Exactly. Perfect way to put it. I like PV's characterization that you tend to play tempo like Boros. You want to be the aggressor and keep using your permission to keep an early lead. You don't really want to be defensive. Yeah, and that's a great way to put it. And Burn, and we're going to go into Burn soon, because Burn is actually a really interesting archetype because you are starting to actually move further down towards the reaction, because you are the aggressor as a Burn deck, but Burn also kills creatures. Who would have thunk it? So you can kind of play a little bit of defense, but it's not necessarily your main game plan. Beautiful. So let's move back to the presentation. Wonderful. Da-da-da. Surely there's an easier way to do this. I'll think about it more. So moving on to, as we said before, great segue into burn. So burn is where you're starting to move off aggro, move away from actively proactive deck building, and you're moving towards mid-range. Because you know that, we all know that in deck philosophy, mid-range decks are the decks that all your top decks are fantastic. And as you're moving away from proactive, you start to move towards like good, efficient removal as part of your package as well. And that sort of takes away from being proactive because you're hoping that your K command hits, or you're hoping that your abrupt decay gets through of something. Like that's sort of like where we're sort of like progressing. And burn really straddles that line quite well because it is the aggressive deck but can play defensively, as Dan mentioned before. So burn. My deck is still proactive and aggressive, but with the flexibility of burn spells, I am able to control the board if I need to. I'm not worried if any of my spells are countered because they mostly all do the same thing. Hit, face. And that is a really good way to think about burn as well. So the deck that I've chosen for this one, a famous deck in the Australian Point Highlander ethos, is One Chin Burn, or You Are Burn. Which is where this is basically as good as you're going to get in Highlander for burn because you have the benefit of pretty good mana. You are able to just splash blue, so you can play things that draw you cards. And you know, burn in modern say tends to just have better burn spells like Boros Charm and stuff like that, where you're splashing into white. But in Highlander, we have access to A-Call, we have access to Delver. I mean, we always have access to Delver Secrets, but like A-Call is like a really big push for that, as well as the good sideboard cards that come with it. So this deck, it's starting to move towards value centric, but a lot of the cards still do the same thing. We have, we have great burn spells with Chain Lightning, Firebolt, Rift Bolt, and then you also have like card draw, and this is where you start to see cards like this is probably towards the end of where you start to see Wheel of Fortune decks. Wheel of Fortune decks in Highlander, if played fairly, not in a combo deck, is basically because you are likely to get empty-handed in any game. But Wheel of Fortune is just like, I don't care that you're going to draw 7 cards because you're probably also holding on to 5, 4, 6 cards. And, you know, if you're versing a blue deck, Wheel of Fortune is fantastic because I would dare say, even 4 curated cards are better than 7 random ones. And that might be a big take. You might want to fiddle with the numbers a little bit, but Wheel of Fortune comes in there because burn doesn't give a crap that you drew 7 cards, because if they untap with a full grip after burning your face for the last few turns, you're probably going to die regardless of what you draw. So you see One Chin Burn, made by Wan Chin Lee, I should say, the deck creator, of course, named in her namesake. You see the blue is very, very, very light splash. We see a Brainstorm, we see a Jace, we see a Delver, we see a Dak Faden. This is a list, admittedly, that misses out on Ancestral Recall, but of course you could play it. Time Walk works well in these decks as well, but this has gone straight for the Double Mox, a Double Mox deck, which is, you can't blame. There's no blaming here for that sort of thing. And then you also have these sort of enchantments to sort of fill out the curve a little bit, to give you a little bit of card advantage, a little bit of disruption as well, which is why we're sort of starting to move. So this deck could definitely play Snap, and I think if you were playing A-Call, you'd probably consider Snap, because that's a great thing to snap back. But I think with this deck, it's quite fast, and playing a Wasteland is just an extra point is probably fine. You find in a lot of aggro decks as well that they actually have a lot of trouble filling in points without blue, because, you know, red black burn is kind of forced into having Mox something, a Mox Clamp, a Mox Jit, but you find that like because the idea is to hit face as much as possible, you don't really be wanting to play Wasteland or Strip Mine because sometimes they don't tap for red. And you can see in a famous Canberra player, Rowan, was playing a very famous 1 point burn or 0 point burn where it's just mono red. He didn't have a mox, he didn't care, he just wanted to hit face. And we can only stand for a person who plays 0 points. So moving on to the next one. So that was burn. Next on our list, we have number 5. And now we're well and truly into mid-range. And this is 4 or 5 color mid-range. So basically the most value-centric and also most proactive version of a mid-range deck. And I want you to think about that in a way that's like we're talking about dead top decks. In 4 or 5 color mid-range, and I'm thinking specifically, as I have in here, 4 color Yidris, 5 color Niv Mizzet. These are cards that are fantastic in a vacuum. All the cards do is just great, good times. So you don't want to, because of Bloodbraid Elf and Shardless Agent and these sorts of cards, they actually benefit from you just having great cards in your deck for the entirety of the game. But as we're moving away from proactive, we have a couple of opportunities to just add good, efficient removal as well. And a lot of efficient removal can also be value-centric as well. Think K-Command. It does 2 things, but it is also a removal spell. So you kind of think about what removal you would want to play if you were playing a mid-range deck. And so it says on here, my deck is all about 2-for-1s, leaking out value against my opponent with Cascade, ETB, and modal spells. Despite the value generation, I'm still a proactive deck. And for this one, I wanted to show off a recent copy, although it can be stated that there's a Birthing Pod deck that has made some huge splashes lately as well that I want to give a specific shout out to, from Isaac Egan and a lot of the Ben boys as well, who are playing it's basically a pod deck, but all of the cards exist in a vacuum, and they're really playing off Omnath Locus of Creation, which was actually quite a huge addition to those ones. So Lachlan, I hope you don't mind me shouting you out for this love to play Magic, because I think this is a really good example of cards that are just good in a vacuum. And I think the thing that really sort of ties it all together, that makes it more suited for this category as opposed to other decks perhaps, is adding Fires of Invention. And I hope you don't mind, Lachlan, this is a 10-point deck. I had to make a couple of changes because we had both Time Walk gain a point recently and also Ren and 6 gain a point, Oko gain a point recently as well. So since this deck had been created, I think Ren and 6 actually got a point in there. Anyway, I made a couple of changes to this, and hopefully you'll enjoy that I added Eskia, God of the Tree, as kind of a thing where you can, on the flip side of Eskia is, I wonder if I can look at it, maybe. Anyway, the backside of Eskia is you want to have mono value cards in your deck, and the same with Fires of Invention as well. These cards are like cards that you don't care about counter spells. You don't really even care about cantrips. All you care about is playing a really good card every turn and accumulating value through that, so letting the value wash over you, so to speak. So these are really also Niv Mizzet decks really come into this as well, where you're sort of moving into 5 color because Niv Mizzet is such a great card. Maybe it draws you 4 cards, maybe it draws you 7 cards, you know. But it's not unlikely that you can build your deck in such a way where Niv Mizzet will be a fantastic value to you. And Fires of Invention, the same value, where you're like, you want to be casting 5-drops and you want to be casting 4-drops, where casting 2 a turn when you have 4 lands on the battlefield, fantastic. You're more than happy to do that. So this deck loved to play Magic. A deck played to a reasonable amount of success, making top 8s and stuff in local communities. You can see here that most of the deck is just based around ETBs, Cascades, as I mentioned before, and sort of things that just like bring value over the course of the game. With Ren and 6 kind of basically drawing you a card every turn, Dak Faden filtering out your bad cards. We have a cheeky combo in here as well, Saheeli Rai, and Teferi as well as kind of a, you know, tempo-ish play where it also can bounce your own things to get back your ETBs. So this is a really great example of a deck that is starting to move towards reactive, but is still a mid-range deck through and through. So moving on to the next one, which is number 6, non-blue mid-range. So this is where you're moving slowly away from... you're still in the value sphere. I think any 2 on either side directly of the line, of either the line of proactive or reactive or value or synergy, you can still sort of see them as like equally synergistic or equally value driven or equally proactive. But what we're moving away from is in non-blue mid-range versus 4 or 5 color mid-range is you're starting to put more reactive spells in your deck. Cards like Hand Disruption, Removal, but you're still trying to make big threats stick, which is what a good mid-range deck does. So in our non-blue mid-range, I've added in my deck is still about 2-for-1s, which is kind of like a thing that you want to think about when you're thinking about deck philosophy when in regards to mid-range. But it says my deck is still for 2-for-1s and great top decks. Some of my control spells are proactive, like Hand Disruption, but there is still a lot of emphasis on board control in my reactive package. And for this, I've gone with Mardu mid-range. I think this is a really great, and one of the decks that I play as well, a really great solid mid-range deck if you don't want to play blue. And if you're not into cantrips and you're not into good cards, you can definitely be playing cards like Mardu and Abzan as well, where you're thinking about, like, think of Abzan in Modern, where you're like happy to cast a Siege Rhino. Kind of affects the board. It's got a trample on it and stuff as well, and like Lingering Souls. These are kind of cards that their main job is to generate value. And there's definitely nothing wrong with that. So as we move on to Mardu mid-range, you can see here that most of the decks are just 2-for-1s. As you see with Karaxa goes into the graveyard, then back out of the graveyard. So you have like, you're kind of using some sort of synergies in there. With Liliana the Veil, of course, as well. But think about big cards like Bone Crusher Giant, where the Stomp is a spell and also the Bone Crusher Giant is a spell. And you're like really happy to have both sides of those cards, because if you manage to kill your opponent's creature, untap, cast Bone Crusher Giant, you're kind of actually casting 2 spells in one. 2-for-1. Same with Palace Jailer. Like, and this can often be more than a 2-for-1, because if you are removing a card from the board, that costs them 1 card and only costs you 1 card. But you're also adding to the board, which is another, you +1, them 0. So now you're at a 2-for-1, but also you gain the Monarchy as well, which if you can keep it, and you have to make deck building considerations to make sure you can keep the Monarchy. But they're still giving you more than even a 2-for-1. And then you sort of back it up with just still good value creatures, Goblin Rabblemaster, Legion Warboss, and then also the best removal in the format as well. I know this is not a good 7-point Highlander card, but Chupacabra technically counts as a value mid-range card. 100% agree. And I think Palace Jailer kind of suits that role even a little bit better in Highlander. Like, Chupacabra was fantastic. And actually, I think Patrick Sullivan had like a really huge like tiff over it, because it was changing the way people play Magic, which is like a thing as well. But like, you can tell that even in the past, deck, cards like this have always existed, where they remove a creature, they add to the board, and maybe even provide something better. And then you got some of the really good removal and Hand Disruption, which is where you're starting to become in a reactive deck. Counselor's Judgment, one of the best removal spells, maybe not so now, but it has spent some time being one of the best removal spells in the format, as well as some better removal spells like K-Command, and some less good removal spells like Kaya's Guile. So you can see here, like, they're all kind of removal spells, but a lot of them actually give you value as well as removing a card. Kaya's Guile, making opponent sacrifice a creature, but also adding to the board or gaining life. The ability to entwine is important. And also cards that just give you card advantage, like Stoneforge, and sort of pseudo card advantage, as I mentioned before, with cards that can go out of the graveyard, come into the graveyard, go out of the graveyard. And that's why you start to see cards that kind of suck in general. Not in this list, but I think Savin's Reclamation is a really good synergy style card that can be played in mid-range decks, because you don't want to put too much effort into putting stuff in the graveyard and getting stuff out of the graveyard, but Savin's Reclamation can generate so much value that it's worth playing a less value-centric card, moving into the synergy section, because it's fantastic. And I mean, before Chupacabra and Necrotal existed. I think I said non-black creatures Necrotal, so slightly worse, of course. I think we might actually get a wriggle on because of the time. But I do love talking about Magic so much. So next we have blue midrange. So, of course, adding to the non-blue midrange, you have blue midrange. Blue midrange is where you start to become more reactive and more synergy-based, because I think it's probably safe to say that as you add more counterspells, your deck becomes more synergistic, because if you play Negate in your deck and your opponent has mono creatures, then suddenly you've made like a deck building decision that's not necessarily based in value, but more based in the synergy of counterspells being good, which is kind of a way to look at it. That's sort of the way that I justified it to myself. So blue mid-range here, it says my deck, think Kess Pile is a really good example, Bug Kurgan, so Bug Control. These are decks that are about 2-for-1s, great value creatures, great top decks, and it'll be a little bit less so than our previous one as you start to play counterspells and cantrips. Cantrips help alleviate this by smoothing out my draws instead of relying on the cards being good at every step of the game. And I think that's like a really interesting way to sort of view the difference between these two, because they're still very close together when you're thinking about deck philosophy. Because they are very close together, but what sort of differentiates them is the desire to now play cantrips, because cantrips is not necessarily a value-based card. It's a card that's helps your deck be better in the future. And the deck that I've chosen for this one is Kess Pile. And Kess Pile has been in the format for a really, really, really long time, but recently sort of re-picked up by Rajdeep Toki, who has been playing Kess Pile for a little while. I mean, he sort of moves through it, but this is like a really classic Kess Pile list. I think Grixis midrange comes and goes, but with the advent of Thassa's Oracle, cards that were Kess Pile ended up just being a Thassa's Oracle deck. Once you play Leovold, you're a resident of this section forever. Yeah, that's a really good point. Leovold being putting into your deck, unless you, of course, oath into it, is where you're putting yourself. You know, you're playing a good value threat. You know, generates you a little bit of card advantage, but it's more about being annoying, which is what good blue decks do. So moving on, this is Raj's deck here. As I mentioned before, they're all public decks as well, and you can always find them by going hashtag RPCW. And this is our look at Rajdeep's deck of Kess Pile, a really classic version of Kess Pile that doesn't involve Thassa's Oracle, which I think is what sort of changes your deck from a mid-range deck to combo control, which we'll go into later. And trust me, you'll see plenty of Thassa's Oracles. But this is a deck that's still based in the mid-range like ethos as well, or the mid-range vibe, where you're playing good value threats, you're getting a little bit of synergy here and there, but you know, the bread and butter is still the same. But where it starts to move off is cards that don't necessarily do anything except keep your deck churning. I think a new advent of Cling to Dust is a really good example of this, where like you may be able to snag a card that your opponent cares about out of your opponent's graveyard, which is fantastic. But it actually serves to be a reactive card that generates you a little bit of advantage as you go through. So this is kind of a good mid-range card that is on the reactive side. And we see cards like still good clean counterspells, but you're starting to see more thicker counterspells like Cryptic Command, where you're planning on getting to turn 4 and being able to tap out, but maybe you've put a creature on the battlefield before, or maybe you put one down after. But these sorts of decks, they're moving more out of value-centric mid-range decks and more into control decks, where think of it like big tempo, essentially. You want to play a big card, but you're happy to do it. You're happy to pivot and do it on turn 10 or turn 6 or whatever. You know, like after you slam a Cryptic, you untap Kess, play an Ancestral Recall. You know, these sorts of things are like you're still just generating value off your plays, but you're moving further into control. And as we see back on the presentation, is that you're really... Oh no, I just opened Discord. This is going to be a nightmare. No, I'm sure it's fine. So as you can see on the... all right. Everything's fine. You can see as we move prior, it's really close to the reactive side because you're starting to become quite a reactive deck as you add more counterspells to your deck, and it's just the way that it's going to be. Let's see if I can close this Discord thing before it... anyway, great. Yeah, fantastic. So as we're moving away from value, we're moving towards reactive. Still proactive, of course, but moving more towards reactive because you need your counterspells to be good for your deck to work. And usually they are, which is why a lot of people play blue-based mid-range, such as Kess Pile. Moving on to our next one, number 8, we have Blue Moon, or Blue-Red Control. And this is a deck, this is an interesting one because it kind of straddles between mid-range and control. And by the virtue of it being called blue-white control, kind of lends itself to the idea of control. But this, to me, is the most value-centric deck that can be considered a control deck, which is why I put it in that area. So it's still heavily reactive, heavy counter spells, but your burn spells are often being used to wipe the board or sort of clear the way. But you're still working towards killing your opponent with good value creatures. So on our thing, we have my deck needs disruption to protect my few win conditions, and the idea of how many win conditions you have is also where you're moving into control, because as we saw on creature aggro with and creature synergy, where you had 29 creatures, 23 creatures, tempo starts to move a little bit down. You're starting to... The amount of win cons that you have gets lower and lower and lower, but they're bigger. So think like Torrential Gearhulk and Blue-White Control. You don't need 29 Gearhulks because you have one, and that's kind of enough. So cantrips are crucial to keep my deck moving, though cards, through cards, so I have that Bolt Snap Bolt when I need it. Not quite a control deck, but I'll take a free Blood Moon win when I can get it. Which I think is like a really good point. And I think basically you can only put Blue Moon in this. So Will Brooks has been playing with Blue Moon a little bit over the last 3 months or so. And this, to me, again, is sort of more what I would consider a Blue Moon deck, where you have very few amount of win cons, but they're still kind of shit. I guess, you know, like in value decks and in aggro decks, you play cheap, efficient threats. And Blue Moon is where you start to play cheap, efficient threats, but soon you're going to move off into really thick, efficient threats, like Torrential Gearhulk, like Teferi 5, these sorts of cards. So we see in Will's deck a mere 13 creatures, so 13 essentially win cons, but as I said before, they're just kind of good value creatures. So maybe you land a Kari Zev on turn 2, and then you attack with it, and then you cast a Blood Moon. So you do have those sorts of like value-y, proactive sort of game plans available to you, but the deck at its source is a reactive deck, where you have cards like Delay, and you have cards like Force of Will, and these sorts of Stifle. What do you mean Vendilion Click is a thick threat? Yeah, that's a really good point. Vendilion Click does a really good job at being a value card that also can win the game. But you can see we're getting into 3/3s, which is quite thick. But this deck kind of still like on the aggressive side. I think yeah, there is a standstill in there as well. The cards that are like you're happy to place a threat and attack with it, and then play a Winter Orb. And then suddenly neither of you are playing Magic, but you're the one with the Bolt to kill their blocker and to attack with your Kari Zev. I think I have a... No, that's fine. So you see here, it's kind of moving a little bit more into the sort of reactive time slot. So moving on to number 9, we have Blue-White X Control. And this is important, determining the distinction, because once you add black, or you add, like if you're making Esper Control, or if you're playing red, where you're playing Jeskai control. These are the control decks that still have the capability to be like as reactive as possible, but still kind of moving towards that value thing and off synergy, but still the least synergistic of those decks, because say for Jeskai control, Bold still go to face, which is kind of the sort of mentality that I was using. So in blue-white control, you're more sorcery speed as well, which is what differentiates you from blue-white control, where you have sorcery speed threats. Like Esper control is really famous for playing a threat and tapping out and saying go. Where you're happy to tap out, but it's still reactive cards. Like say, think about the Force of Will and think about Teferi 5 and stuff, where that's kind of straddling the line, I suppose. But where you're adding more sorcery speed, say Planeswalkers, or sorcery speed control, where you say tap out control. And Esper's really a huge deck in this space as well. So this one says, I'm definitely controlling the board with walkers, and I'm definitely controlling the stack with efficient counterspells, but damn, it feels good to him to Torak on turn 2. Which is the sort of idea that Tim Evers' Esper walkers with Abyss and Moat are a great example of this archetype. A fantastic point. Any sort of Moat Abyss deck as well is where you're kind of, you're controlling the board, but less so with counterspells. So the one that I've actually chosen for this one that I wanted to show off was Bauble and Coke, which is actually kind of a prolific deck in this space. And the reason that it is where it is that and Elspeth Sun Champion, a great example of that as well, where you're controlling the board, but you're also playing really efficient threats that also answer or block or that sort of thing. Where I went with Bauble and Coke, and a really interesting innovation that Drew Carter has done with Bauble and Coke is the addition of baubles, where you're playing Phyrexian Furnace, you're playing Scrabbing Claws, where they work as a sort of a version of Cling to Dust that sticks on the battlefield, and you don't have to put it in your hand. If you play a turn 1 Phyrexian Furnace, you might own your opponent who's playing a Graveyard Synergy deck, rip me, or you could be playing a deck that kind of has a cantrip attached to it, so you're kind of like pre-booking a cantrip, you should think of it as. So things like Mishra's Bauble as well is a great example of this as a Bauble. You're kind of pre-booking a cantrip, and that's where you're kind of moving into these sort of tap-outy type of control decks, is that you're establishing more to the board, and this is kind of where that where you're being more reactive. So in this deck as well, you have those you have cards like Entreat the Angels, which does a really good job of being able to tap out as well, because you're not necessarily sure when you'll Miracle and Entreat the Angels unless you have some sort of deck manipulation, but you're more than happy to tap out, make 3 Angels, say go, because you've probably already done a good job of controlling the board up until then. And once you decide to you want to play Baubles, Monastery Mentor becomes even dumber. Yeah, and I think that's a really good way to think about it as well, is that Monastery Mentor is a really, really key card in this archetype, because the best time to play reactive spells, in Esper Control, or you're playing your Baubles and your cantrips, is in your first main phase, before you attack, to make your Monastery Mentor bigger, and to make your Monk tokens bigger, because that prowess is obviously so important. So once you start to move into prowess cards like Monastery Mentor, you're more sort of concerned with tapping out for your control, for your finishes, but they're not really big finishes. They're just like little finishes, but they promote you playing in your first main phase. Not to say that this deck isn't a reactive deck that doesn't play on the stack, because of course you have cards like Remand, cards like Daze, cards like Force of Will, the cards that make you a control deck and like pushes you into that sort of synergy archetype. So moving on, we have Draw Go Control. And Draw Go Control is where you're very firmly moving away from value, because as I mentioned before, your counterspells are pretty contingent on you needing a counterspell at the correct time, and that's where sort of your cantrips are more important, and brainstorming every turn is more important with Jace, because you need to be able to push, you need to be able to have the right spell when you need it. And that's kind of where you think about control as kind of a bad version of a combo deck, because you need a counterspell when a spell is being cast, or you need a removal spell when cards are being needed to be removed. And so this is where Draw Go Control is really heavily in that reactive space, where it's pretty contentious actually at this point as well, where it is the most reactive deck, I would say. But because it's moving away from value, it didn't get that slot right next to the reactive line where Blue-White Control got, and Blue-Art Control got. It had to move a little bit to the side because it is more synergy based, although I can be proven wrong, of course. So Draw Go Control, as I mentioned on the slide, possibly the most reactive deck, but less concerned with value than Tap Out Control. Win conditions are only needed when my opponent has already given up the game. Hey, Tucking to Fairy turn 5 counts as a win con. A little bit of joke there for you. So in here we're seeing, and this is, not many people are playing Blue-White Control lately, and I'm not sure if that's just the way it goes, or maybe it's just you're more likely to want to play, if you're playing 2 colors, probably play red for Blood Moon. And that's a great point by Diamond Dude as well. You're thinking Fact of Fiction, think twice, Omen of the Sea. These are expensive cantrips that you're so happy to cast. You're so happy to cast them. And this deck here specifically is light on win cons because locking the game is its own win con. Where you're playing cards like Wrath of Gods, Supreme Verdict, Teferi 5. These are all cards, Elspeth Sun's Champion as well. These are all cards that kind of make you more into a prison deck because your goal is to lock down the game and then play a threat. And you hear so often in Blue-White Control decks, in Modern, say, for example, it's time for me to turn the corner. Or, uh-oh, here comes the corner, I can see it. Where you're controlling the game until your opponent has given up the desire to play, and then you submit a win con. You're like, all right, I'm going to turn my Gideon of the Trials into a 4/4 now every turn. And this deck specifically is playing very few win cons for the reason that they're playing Humility. And Humility, of course, is a lock piece, but can be played in Blue-White Control because you're more than happy to not play any creatures, and you're turning your opponent's creatures into 1/1s that have no abilities. Really fantastic card in Highlander and in modern day Magic in general, because creatures are getting better and better. Also because of Laius. Yeah, that's true. I think you actually, if you Shark Typhoon after the Humility, it comes in great. Yeah, and that's a really good point as well, where you have your Gideons and your man lands, or your creature lands. Your creature lands will still remain their card type as well. So that's a nice little side point when you're thinking about Humility specifically. And ways to break Humility are often quite small, and that's why you see Blue-White Control in Eternal formats play both Humility and Moat, because these are just 2 4-mana enchantments that win the game by virtue of your opponent not having fun anymore. Which is why we're moving a little bit further away from value and more into synergy, because you're starting to play prison pieces. And this is where you start to come into synergy as well, where combo control is actually slotted right in here before we get to prison. And prison is a really good example of that as well, where you're actually just trying to play prison. So, Diamond Dude, this is my wheelhouse. This is everybody's wheelhouse, I think, in modern day Highlander, because it's so easy to slot in a 2-card combo where you're not all in. And, of course, Fastbond Crucible Strip Mine, that's a really good example as well. So I want you to think about Strip Locking, Marit Lage, but I also want you to think about Thassa's Oracle, Tainted Pact, Splinter Twin. And these are 2-card combos, but there's not necessarily a way, they're not necessarily your only way to win, I should say. So it's moved into synergy because, as I said before, the reason that this is a control deck that is the furthest, coming towards the up into the furthest synergy-based deck, is because you're really, you're moving cards away from good value, and you're moving them into Thassa's Oracle, and you're moving them into Tainted Pact. And if I'm playing Thassa's Oracle, Tainted Pact, I should probably be playing Demonic Consultation. And if I'm playing Demonic Consultation, maybe I should play Divining Witch. And you're kind of moving away, and maybe you don't play Divining Witch, but these sorts of differentiates combo control from combo up here in the corner. We have 2-card combos all in, where you're thinking about cards that don't care about synergy, don't care about reaction, and are just actively trying to assemble the 2-card combo. And Lands kind of falls into this bit as well, because Lands is also an interesting deck in the way that it can be considered a mid-range deck, and it can be considered a combo deck, and it can be considered a prison deck. But the reason it sits here specifically is because you locking out your opponent is actually like a pretty common win condition when you're playing cards that are like Sylvan Scrying, and you're playing cards like Wrenn and Six and these sorts of things. Like, you're more than happy to devote slots to locking your opponent out of the game, and that's where it kind of sits in the control aspect of it, but is still sort of a prison-y deck. So as I said in here, combo control is a delicate balance. If you add too many combo pieces, you risk getting blown out by sideboard hate. If you don't add enough, you may have a tough time assembling. A good combo control deck can win easily without comboing, but if the game goes long enough, it's bound to happen. I was speaking to a very fantastic person on Reddit who was talking more about resiliency versus redundancy. And this is where you're kind of towing the line with combo control as well, because your inevitability with having a 2-card combo that you're not all in is actually suited pretty well for a control deck in general, because control decks are aiming to win that inevitability race, and the problem is getting those early games you don't want to get aggroed out. Diamond Dude, as a small outside, Diamond Dude says, fun story, one time I was playing Modern KCI and my opponent managed to surgical extraction my Pirate Spellbomb, so I had to loop Spine of Ishtar to vindicate all of their permanents and attack with Strap Taller. Yeah, exactly. So that's where you're kind of moving away from 2-card combos in the control aspect and moving up towards engine. So KCI is an engine deck, and we'll talk about engines later, but they're also like, you don't really want to be winning in ways that are outside of your main game plan, which is why you're moving towards synergy, because your cards actually have to work together, because they don't really do that much outside of it. Tainted Pact has a small amount of value. It's a kind of a shit cantrip, or a shit tutor, I should say, because you are moving, you're able to use it outside of its recommended use, which is exiling your library, but it's not your main game plan. And Thassa's Oracle kind of sucks, but like, you don't want these sort of dead draws in a value deck, which is why making a mid-range Thassa's Oracle deck is kind of a bit difficult. I've seen my fair share of Demonic Consultation for Force of Will on CDH. Yeah, I've lost to me exiling my entire library by accident because I was looking for a cantrip to a counterspell to stop myself from losing the game. So the deck that I've chosen for this one is something that we saw in the Bluebell tournament of last year, was Gifts Unpacked by Dan Abraham, who I believe is actually in the chat now, so shout out to Dan. This is a really fantastic version of combo control, and something that I really wanted to point out, because there he is right there. So thank you very much for not submitting your deck, for showing it off last Bluebell tournament. I loved it, and I thought it really well suited the idea of combo control, because Crackling Drake is a card that exists. It gains you a little bit of value. It's really great at beating face, and it kind of has a little bit of synergy with the rest of your game plan, which is, you can exile your deck and attack with it and that sort of thing. But this deck can easily win without Thassa's Oracle. That's fine. You can easily win without Thassa's Oracle, but Thassa's Oracle gives you that 2-card combo that allows you to win the game from there. So this deck here, it plays like a control deck. You have Gifts Ungiven, and this deck is actually more based around Gifts Ungiven and the value that you get from it. Dan says, my version was a bit greedy because it had A-Call, Loops, and Oracle, but no Tainted Pact, which may have been crazy. Yeah, it's worthwhile to say that the original list was playing A-Call. So back in the day, you could play Thassa's Oracle, A-Call, and Mystic Sanctuary in the same deck. The committee said no, which is probably reasonable, because this deck really, really, really took great advantage of that, because you can just loop A-Call as a win con, but you can also win with Thassa's Oracle, and you can also... you're tutoring, but you're also able to just stick to the board and play your counter spells and play your removal. And that's why it's kind of a good example of a combo control deck. Moving on to one of my favorites in the control archetype is Prison. And Prison is where you are moving further towards synergy and actually moving towards proactive, because you're being less reactive by virtue of you not really caring what your opponent is doing, because the Prison deck, you know, if we think big red in Legacy, where you're just like, Simian Spirit Guide, you know, land Blood Moon. And that's your version of control, where you're actually just trying to lock out your opponent as quickly as possible, which is why it's really synergistic, and it's almost a combo deck, because you need Simian Spirit Guide, Desperate Ritual, Blood Moon for the deck to work, and that's where the sort of redundancy comes into the aspect as well. But your deck is a control deck that actively needs to work towards the goal of locking your opponent out. And locking your opponent out is something that control decks do quite well, but Prison takes it to the next level by doing it as quickly as possible. So the control deck that everyone hates. I don't use counter spells or removal to control the game, but if my opponent can't answer an Ensnaring Bridge or a Nether Void, I am sure to win. Win conditions are not really important, and that's like a reason to sort of think about as well, where your win conditions, Monkey Beats is a really, really, really common win condition for Prison decks, because it actually doesn't matter how you win the game. You're stopping your opponent from playing Magic. That's great. Everyone wins. So for this one, we're actually in Highlander. There's a lot of space for innovation in the Prison sphere, because no one's really looked into it that much. Lantern Control is a great example. Yeah, fantastic. Now, unfortunately, Prison decks, we don't actually see too much. So I had to really scour the planet for a good Prison deck outside of Philip Nicholson's That's So Raven Crime, which is the perfect idea of a Prison deck, and one of the few in the Highlander archetype. This deck is really about trying to put down a threat really quickly. I have just updated this list. Well, we should compare, because I also updated the list to make it legal right now. So it is currently a 7-point list. I had to drop a Mox, I think, but that's good that we still have Ebenezer working on it as well. So thank you, James, for that. But you see with this list, you don't see any counter spells. You see very few removal spells. But what we're trying to do as quickly as possible is maybe cast a Sinkhole on turn 1, you know, or maybe block with Ophiomancer. Like, Ophiomancer is like a fantastic card. Here's Ebenezer as well chiming in, so thank you very much for that. But this deck is actively trying to lock your opponent out of the game as quickly as possible, and that's its only game plan. So we see cards that are unique to Highlander, like the Abyss, like Nether Void, and like Smokestack as well, which we kind of only see in sort of Cube, really, or like really janky Legacy decks. But like, these are sorts of cards that like, you're both ruining the battlefield, but you're obviously geared towards doing it better. So Smokestack, of course, synergizes really well with Ophiomancer and Eternal Witness. Pardon me. Smallpox is, of course, a combo with Titania, where like, you're happy to get your cards back out of the graveyard, and you're happy to regrowth, and you're happy to cast Life from the Loam as like a way to sort of reaccumulate the loss that you've made by dunking both of your opponents with synergistic effects, as the name suggests, like Smallpox, like the Abyss, like Nether Void, where these cards actively work towards both of you, but your deck is sort of geared more towards it. So I just opened Discord again, so I'm just going to unpin this from my dashboard, because otherwise I'm just going to keep opening it. So the next one on our wonderful, wonderful list, and as we move away from combo, and we move into move away control and move away into combo, we have ramp decks. Now ramp decks is kind of where it sits really close with the Prison archetype, because your deck kind of really has to work together, and you're trying to cast cards ahead of the curve. So excellent. Sorry, I just had to close Discord. So we see in this, like, it's a combo deck, and make no doubt about that, because it's so heavily based in synergy with, you know, cast Channel, cast Emrakul, or cast Mana Crypt and all that sort of stuff. And these are all synergy cards, because you find with ramp, your cards really have to work together. Because if you get too much ramp and no payoffs, you'll lose the game. If you have too many payoffs and no ramp, you'll lose the game. So this is where you're kind of working in that combo sphere, but really heavily based in synergy. So as it says in the thing, my perfect curve is not 1 drop into 2 drop into 3 drop. It's ramp spell into 6 drop. My cards really have to work together, although I am usually still the aggressor, overcoming my opponent with giant creatures and spells. And this is where combo works really well, because it is moving up towards proactive, because as a combo deck, you are usually the aggressor. And so the deck that I've chosen for this one, it's hard to find a good ramp deck outside of Elves. I think Elves is a really good example, but a lot of recent Highlander Elves decks is kind of a little bit more based in mid-range. Like, you're long gone are the idea of an elf deck that's elf Craterhoof, and more because of Highlander and the way that it moves, it's beneficial to play a few elves and a Hydroid Krasis or an Uro or something like that, where you're kind of playing more mid-rangey threats and you're less concerned with casting an 8-drop or a 10-drop. And this deck by Haju in Finland, great guy in the Discord as well, is medium red. And medium red is, or big red is, it depends on who you ask. Medium red originally piloted by, I believe, Max Phillips in Max Peacock rather, in CanCon of 2019. But these are decks that you're kind of a ramp deck where you're still playing your this is sort of a modern take on a ramp deck, I should say, where you're still excited to play a Goblin Guide, which is an aggressive card, and you're still happy to play Earthshaker Kenra, but your deck is still really packed full of fast mana, which is where you see your Mox Diamond, your Mana Crypt, your Chrome Mox, your Mana Vault, your Soul Ring, your Smuggler's Copter. Like, these are kind of a new take on a ramp deck where you're still playing those ramp cards. You're still playing those ramp cards, but you're happy to exile a Goblin Guide to your Chrome Mox so that you can play a Thought-Knot Seer, you know? Like, these are sorts of, like, puts you in a little bit more of a redundancy, deck building style. So I understand that it's not Cloud Post, it's not Channel, but it's kind of a sort of new way to think about it, where you're happy to play Soul Lands, you're happy to play Soul Ring, but you're still sort of you're still able to go up the curve because you're not a prison deck. You're still trying to be pretty aggressive, and you're still trying to get that those sorts of places. And as Diamond Dude mentioned in the chat, really eloquently put, you can't play Cloud Post because there's only 2 Locusts. You can't play Tron because there's only 3 Trons. I have seen Tron lands being played in mono green ramp, because whatever, you're playing Sylvan Scrying, you're playing Exhibition Map, you may as well give it a red hot go. Your deck is mostly cards that produce colorless mana anyway, so it's like kind of not a big deal, I guess. So this is a more contemporary take on what I would call a ramp deck in Australian Sunpoint Highlander. Moving on. Now, this is where cards are combo. Like, we are really heavy in the combo stuff, and I really want to talk about engine-based combo as opposed to 2-card combo all in, because these are 2 completely different archetypes, and the difference is that you're how heavily based you are in synergy. So engine-based combo, like KCI, like Storm, like these are decks, like as artifacts, as it says in the example. Your deck is, all of your cards actually work towards the same thing, and they all kind of work together until you can kind of go off, which is like which is where Storm comes in, where you try to play lots of spells in one go, and why you're more sort of synergistic, still proactive, but still quite synergistic in the way that you play, where all your cards definitely have to work together. Whereas 2-card combo all in, you're putting cantrips in your deck to kind of smooth out your draws, and your deck doesn't actually have to all work together. You just need to find 1 Entomb and 1 Reanimate. So the one that I chose, of course, was Storm. And Storm is obviously a fantastic way to think about this archetype as an engine-based combo, because you were trying to find the one deck to go off. And so by virtue of that, you actually don't have that many slots available to you, many flex slots. Can I have a link to that UI control list from earlier? Yes, you can find all lists by just typing !deck in the thing. So a lot of good standstill cards have come out lately, Brandon, just so you know. But Tinker Storm, I think, is like the perfect example of a control deck in a storm deck in Contemporary Highlander, where you're allowing the you're an engine deck, but you're still trying to tinker into Bolus's Citadel, and you have this sort of backup plan of Inkwell Leviathan and stuff like that, but your deck is still more than anything a combo deck. So you have a few different versions. We see a lot of versions, but they're all storm decks. So you see, and I almost certainly should put sort of Zerza or Urza artifact decks in this sort of realm as well, because they're definitely combo decks, but they're kind of engine in the way that Urza is obviously a lot better if you include a bunch of artifacts in your deck. But Storm is a specifically good example of this, because your deck kind of does nothing except for the turns that you're ready to go off. Besides a cantrip here or there, Brainstorm Pot of Preordain, where you're just smoothing out your draws, most of your deck slots are devoted to storming off in one turn, and that's why you are a synergy-based combo deck. And Tim's deck makes a really good example of that. I'm curious as to why Tim decided to play Inkwell Leviathan over Blightsteel Colossus. You would have to ask him, of course, but I can tell you from my experience, Blightsteel sucks. I think Blightsteel is just too easy to get rid of. There's too many main deck artifact hate cards in the format. It's too easy to maybe be bounced. If it's bounced back to your hand, it sucks. But Inkwell Leviathan is kind of good in that aspect because you're playing Shroud. Specifically for Shroud. And also because lots of people play blue cards. Or Island specifically, I should say. So this is sort of a this is a really good example of an engine-based combo deck. Moving on to our second last one, we have 2-card combos all in. And this is like all in Time Vault decks, all in Flash decks, and all in Reanimator decks. Like, these are sort of decks that you can play Reanimator in combo control, or you can play Time Vault combo in combo control. But what makes this so far away from combo control is that you are actively establishing the combo as quickly as you can with as many redundant pieces as you can find. So, like, if you're maybe playing, like, Reanimate's a great example. I have a lot of experience with Reanimator. I can play Unburial Rites, Reanimate, Entomb, Exhume, Grizzlebrand, Iona, Elishnorn. That's like a 5-card package. But in this version, you don't play 5-card package in your control deck. You play 15, 16, all these huge cards that are all redundant in the way that you're trying to push your game plan forward. So you're more or less based in synergy and more based in establishing your 2-card combo. Time Vault Key, Entomb, Reanimate, these sorts of examples. Surprisingly, I didn't choose Reanimate because I thought it'd be a little bit of a wanker move to choose my own deck. I decided to go with Sneeki Breeki, which was like a sort of new take on an Oath deck. So this is a Rug deck that is playing Sneak Attack, Show and Tell, Oath of Druids, and also Tinker that gets Blightsteel, that gets Inkwell Leviathan, like all those sorts of like cheaty giant card onto the battlefield style deck. So when you're even considering this deck, it's really good when you're thinking about all your cards work towards the same game plan, because your new mistress, this is a fantastic list. Where even your Wellspine Worm is a good example, of course, because it's great if you Oath into it, it's great if you Sneak Attack into it. This is a kind of deck where you're more based in like trying to land one threat and have it win the game immediately. Where in Reanimator, it kind of you want to stick a threat for as long as possible. But this deck does nothing except the 2-card combo. And if you can't establish the 2-card combo, you're probably going to lose the game because you don't have a win con outside of that 2-card combo. Although, if you're looking very closely, you might be able to peek over and see a Blood Moon, which kind of counts. But this deck is a 2-card combo through and through because all you're trying to establish is Show and Tell creature, Oath of Druids, Forbidden Orchard, Sneak Attack creature, Tinker, an artifact on the battlefield. You know, these are sorts of ideas where you are a combo deck, but you're being more proactive in pushing those cards onto the battlefield and getting that combo established as quickly as possible. So that's what I called, and shout out to Michael Lethal Leslie for that one. The next one we have, and the final one, is a creature combo. And I like this one in where it sits in regards to proactive versus reactive, value versus synergy, because you can kind of win with your shitty creatures, but less so than creature synergy, less so than tribal decks, less so in I want to attack with creatures and I'm happy to if I need to. These are cards that you're more devoted to trying to establish whatever creature combo that you've elected to go with. Think Infect, think Sprowess, think Alarin. These cards have the ability to win with 2-card combos. Have the ability to win with creatures, but that is by no means the main game plan. The main game plan is to attack with a Kiln Fiend that's 20 power. I couldn't think of any better deck to put in this category except for Sprowess, or Rug Prowess, piloted by the great Sophie Pizzuto, winner of the Bluebell Season 1, but also sort of a pioneer of this archetype, where you're moving away from Prowess, which is more sort of based in that sort of value-centric, but all trying, like, it's almost an engine deck in the way that a combo plays because you want to set up your hand so that you can go off in one turn. But the reason that this is sort of in a different space to those engine decks is because you can also just attack with creatures. Yeah, great point, Dan. Dan has seen it firsthand and has lost to it before, and correct, it is incredibly terrifying. Even when there's no creature on the battlefield, they can untap and then kill you, and it's terrifying. So we see with this deck, this deck really plays like Infect. I think it is a really good way to think about it because Infect kind of doesn't really exist at the moment in Highlander because there's not enough good Infect creatures. But it kind of plays on the same axis, and actually kind of looks like Legacy Infect when you look at cards like Berserk, Become Immense, Blossoming Defense. Funnily enough, I don't know whether to put Modern Izzet Phoenix back when it could play Faithless Looting in the segment or in blue midrange. Yeah, we should get to that at the end because it is a really good way to sort of think about it. But with Rug Sprowess specifically, you are about as close as you can get to a aggro deck without being an aggro deck. So there's lots of memes in that aspect of like whether or not it's an aggro deck or whether or not it's a combo deck. I put it in the combo slot, but it is an aggro deck. I mean, it can play like an aggro deck, but I think it's well suited in that combo slot right up towards the top. And that's it. So I want to I have a couple examples of deck lists that we should review. But I also wanted to ask if there's anything that you would change, if there's something that you might think could be improved upon. And while I do that, I'm just going to close a bunch of these windows and bring up some of the examples that people have asked for previously in the Discord. If you're not in the Discord, I highly suggest it because we get a lot of stuff like that. Here we have a raid. Thank you very much, Epic Eki. Fantastic friend of mine, wonderful content producer. You will actually see us together. It is very almost time for shitposting. That's right. You actually came at the perfect time because this is a great time to shitpost. So welcome, Epic Eki, Jimbo. Welcome the Jig, a huge player in the shitposting community. More than happy to have you here. You will see us at the end. I'm actually going to talk about other business after this presentation is done. But you will see Jimbo and I together in the same window. Not in the same country. It's in the same country, not in the same state. But we will be streaming together on Sunday, and I'm really much looking forward to that. So I have a couple examples here that people have said where would we like to put it. I'm going to leave it up to chat and see if the archetype wheel actually works, and if people can. I think I missed a bit. Hold on. This one. Yeah. So let me pull up a deck and we can have a look at it. Yeah, it's the VOD will be made available on CBR MTG, youtube.com/CBR MTG. So that's definitely available to you. All right. This is our first deck, also by Pat. And I tried to pull up the visual spoiler, but it's not quite working with me. So this looks like, oh my god, this deck stats. I'm gonna call your mum. Maybe I can fix this somehow. All right, let's just go to details instead. So let's see. So we have 18 lands, which is a low amount of lands. Tends to, yeah. What am I doing here? Let's go 100%. Let's go moving here. Moving here. Oh my god. All right. Well, let's not look at deck stats because it kind of sucks. And we'll look at a Moxfield list. So this looks like a sort of elves list, and elves and the card names can't be read. Yeah, cool. All right, well, let's go to a visual spoiler. And this is by Will Brooks, who sent me this list called On the Gold. Oh, no, this is Mortarpod. My apologies. Unsure if I should change my plans. So this is, so let's have a look. So we have 32 creatures, huge amount of creatures. We have one Planeswalker, and they're all gold cards. So kind of thinking about maybe if there's some synergy here. We can see a Glittering Wish. Is there a... so what synergy are we looking for? I think the synergy is multicolored cards and a couple of bits and bobs here. So thinking about this deck where we have 7 removal, we have some sorceries, some instances, some removal spells, some synergy, but it seems to be well and truly a creature deck. Is there a deck that is this not creature synergy? Can I accurately put this into creature synergy? Or is this something maybe along the lines of a non-blue mid-range deck? A little bit hard to say. Oh, here, we found our payoff. Rian, Angel of Rebirth, giving our multicolored creatures +1/+0. So I'm going to go out on a limb. I feel like this is more non-blue mid-range. Okay. That's okay. More based in value, but has the tendency to less based in synergy. I can totally agree with that. I think there's not much synergy in this deck to be heard of, except for Rian. But the rest is like we're putting creatures together. So I could agree with that as non-blue mid-range. Cool. All right, I'll agree with that. And I think the last one that we have as an example is, yeah, it looks like modern rock junk. So non-blue mid-range in your recasting. Okay, great. I think we can agree to that. I'm pretty happy with that. And for our final example, we have wow, Kess Pod, a pod-based deck. 21 creatures, 4 sorceries, 8 instants, and a birthing pod. So we do have pod-based decks, but are we thinking that maybe this is actually this is kind of closer to just maybe Kess Pile, where we're not really comboing off, but we do have a couple of synergy cards-ish, but they're still... The synergy is the value. Like, I'm thinking like Spellseeker's kind of... And there's also foil. The Spellseeker is kind of a synergy-based card in that you have to have a good spell to get, but maybe it can be considered a value-based card because it's a 1/1 with text that also gets you a... a removal spell or a Time Walk. I think that this is just Kess combo, and the pile can just make up any 2-drop into any instance or sorcery. Yeah, that's probably a good way to creature combo. Yeah, no, that's a good way to think about it. I think I did have sort of creature combo exclusively for 2-card combos, whereas the combo, as I mentioned before in our presentation, that the combo actually comes from, in this deck, looping Time Walk through Kess, through Spellseeker, through, do we have Eternal Witness? Yeah, through Eternal Witness. So definitely can consider it a creature combo deck. Could also even consider it just blue-based mid-range. But we're even sort of low. I guess we do have a couple of interactive spells here. So I think maybe either creature combo or blue mid-range. So one of those two I think works pretty well. Where are the Thalia decks? I don't even think we've seen one Thalia deck in this whole presentation. So unless anyone has any sort of... there's no shush command on this one, unfortunately. So if anyone has any other examples, we can go through that. But otherwise, that's about it. In regards, I'll start doing what we have in our other business and questions and shitposting. So feel free to do your questions, do your shitposting, however you want, while I talk about our other business. So in the garbage where they belong. Yeah. Oh well, I guess we've added a specifically shushing Jack Jiggins commands. That's fantastic. So first on our link of other business, we have the Bluebell Top 8 Season 2. Huge. This is going to be a big event. We have a program that I made that I guess we'll release to the public as well, because it's kind of like an agenda. We have commentators, new commentators from last time as well. So if you caught the Bluebell Season 2, we also changed the infrastructure because besides making presentations, my computer doesn't actually have the capability, nor does my internet have the capability, thank you Australian Broadband, to be able to stream an event of that capacity. So I would highly suggest checking out Jimbo's stream on Sunday. That is twitch.tv/epiceki at 11 a.m. for the pre-game show on Sunday. If I do my maths correctly, that's 2, 12, 14. It's like 2 days and 14 hours from now, 13 and a half hours from now. If you're in a different time zone, otherwise look it up. It's the Canberra-Melbourne time, 11 a.m. on Sunday. So don't forget to check that out. That's some actual live gameplay. We really pride ourselves, between Jimbo and I, we have a shared love of promoting sports commentary style Magic, which is what we saw maybe 5 years ago in the WotC prepared Magic scene, but has kind of moved into the esports kind of realm, and it doesn't really fill the same void. But we'll have commentators. We have like the bingo sheet. We also talk about the league as well. The league that took 3 months to do, 12 weeks, 6 rounds, 60 players. No, 34 players. So that was a huge thing, and that was like, we really like to round it off with a big event. So don't forget to catch that on 11 a.m. on Sunday. The next thing on our list as well is the MTGO League. So if you were on the 7 Point Highlander Facebook page, you may have seen Isaac talking live, or you may have even caught him live. He was talking about the MTGO League that's coming up in the next 2 months, to follow on from the MTGO League that we just completed. So Isaac and Jim and Graham and stuff, we've all been working, and Vance, Pat, we've all been working really hard together to bring a really good MTGO experience in a league style to the Australian 7 Point Highlander community. And the reason that's so important is because a lot of people like MTGO, but without a community, you can't really buy in. So this is like a perfect opportunity to buy into MTGO if you were looking to play Australian 7 Point Highlander. So keep an eye out on the 7 Point Highlander Discord. in the MTGO League channel, but it'll also be posted everywhere where you can consume Australian 7 Point Highlander content for the next one, because it's really important, because it's free entry and really great prizes. This time we had about $1,000 worth of prizes to win, and that top 8 is actually going to go ahead live as well, so keep an eye out for that. We just have to work out timing and stuff. I kind of took a perfect time slot, which was this weekend. Exactly. It makes it easy for the non-Australian peasants to get into the format. So that's really important as well, because our international audience is growing, and we want it to be an international format where Australian 7 Point Highlander has actually existed for about 23 years. But it sort of stayed in the realms of Australia because it was a fun format for old dudes to play with each other. But now we're diversifying, and we're moving towards an international audience as well, and that's really important. So really excited to get out there, show that Australian 7 Point Highlander is a really fun format and a really great community format, which you don't get with Wizards supported formats, is that because it's actually community controlled, people actually listen when things, when Oko needs 2 points, it's like, we're quick to act. So it's like, it's good to run those community run formats. And this to me is one of my favorites, my favorite of the community run formats. And the last point is the future of CBR MTG. So, I'm going to stop doing this. I did the Bluebell Open. That was fantastic, and we had such a fantastic time. And I'll be doing the next Bluebell Open, and that's going to be fantastic, and that's going to be a really great time. But I've been doing content creation. I've been doing Magic stuff as well. So if I'll get to that in a second. Multimedia as well. I'm sort of just gonna stop doing it. I'm gonna keep my decks because they're like a lot of money put into decks, and I don't want to move them into cash because I'll just spend it on some other garbage. But in particular, moving down the way in which I interact with the Magic community, because I've been working basically full time on Magic over the last 2 days to get this presentation done and another couple of presentations done, and I do it because I get emotional satisfaction to a really high degree from doing work like this with you, my community. And we've built a fantastic community, and we've all enjoyed each other's company to such a great extent. And I think it's actually a really perfect time to move off and do something more. So I'm a non-practicing artist, so I'm going to start to do art, which I'm really excited about. So in regards to the website, the website is probably going to, I'm going to host it for 1 more year, and it's going to sort of go into sleepy mode after that, and you'll be able to find it on the Wayback Machine. So that's cbrmtg.com. Other than that, what I really want to be focusing on is that it is the end of CBR MTG, and me as like a specific person who's going to be working really hard in this space. That is ending, but the work that the community has put forward to making this great community is actually only just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So people like Jimbo and Graham as well, huge voices in the community, and really influential in the way that they've handled the community. And I really want to give a huge thanks to them, specifically Jimbo and Graham, for the work that they've done to make this community really fantastic. And that is not going to stop. And so anything that I do Magic related is going to be going on, is going to be doing through Epic Eki, twitch.tv/Epic Eki, which is Jimbo's channel. And hopefully he doesn't mind me saying that, because I'm like signing myself up. But he's already agreed to host the Bluebell Season 2 Top 8, which I'm really excited about. And also he has a fantastic stream and is a really great person. So it's like really beneficial to move people to the work that he's doing, because there was a time in my life where I was going to be a full-time content creator, and now sort of Jimbo wants to do that as well, and that's really fantastic and like a really exciting thing for him, and I really want to promote the work that he's doing as well. Webcam tournaments, they're going to be either sporadic or taken over by someone else. I'm still yet to work out exactly who will take the reins for that, but the tournament organizing, I'm going to take a pretty big step back from, but I want the webcam events to continue. We were doing webcam events for most of last year, and it provided a really fun aspect to play with your paper cards. Oh, that's you discovered it through the PK video. Yeah, and I think with the work that I was doing with PK, there was actually like I think there was like a really, really high chance, not tooting my own horn, that, I could be sort of a progenitor. But the work that I was doing when I was with PJ was actually coupled with the work that I was doing with Legacy as a format. And like the reason that this channel has so many views now and so many not so many subscribers, so many followers, actually total moving people off subscribing because it actually doesn't really make me that much money. Not that I'm doing it for the money regardless, but, the work that I was doing when I was sort of at the top of like, traveling up that content creation line, I was doing work with PK and I was like setting up to do work with Saffron Olive and do work with Tolarian Academy as well. And like these sorts of people, but they were really sort of heavily tied to the work that I did in Legacy, where I was streaming every single week. And I stopped doing that, and then viewership, of course, dropped because I was only working in the 7-Point Highlander space. And that was only because I sort of enjoyed doing it to such a great extent. And I enjoyed playing Legacy, but not to the extent that I was doing it every single week. So webcam events, I will be moving them off, but I might even play every now and then, depending on where it comes to. But I'm going to be working in a scenario where the reliance on me to be doing work for the Highlander community is nil to low, and where I'm just sort of a contributor, I suppose. So I wanted to put that at the end because some of you are, long-time watchers, and some of you actually really care about the work that I do, and like, some of you love me, and it's like really fun and exciting. But I'll always still be in the Discord, and I'll always still be doing my stuff. But in regards to Magic, there's like so many other things as well. I like started a polyamorous relationship, but that's been really fun, but it like takes up a lot of my time, and like I want to be doing more accessible gifts for my community, and like Magic is a really fun format, but it's not really necessarily accessible to other people, and that sort of broadens your horizons to doing more artistic things as well. So I have a rock opera that I have in the midst that's probably going to end up being a D&D session. Although one of camera people's one of the better ones, yeah. So this is probably one of the last times that you'll see this channel streaming. I'll be moving off onto Epic Eki, Twitch, which is something that you should be looking at into the future. The VOD will be available on the YouTube, and that's not going anywhere, but the YouTube is basically just for us because I turned off all of the ad revenue just completely, just across the board. And when you do that with YouTube, YouTube does not try to get your videos out. So whereas we were getting 1,000 views or whatever, like it's now moved down to 17, and that's fine because that's the work that I do and I love to do it. But the things that will end up being on the YouTube will be replays and stuff like that, unless Jim wants it. So, but I'll talk about that with him. But things to keep out for the Moto League, more webcam events in the future, perhaps through a different tournament organizer, but with MTG Melee we're actually able to do it a little bit easier. Oh, that's really sweet to say, multimedia. I really appreciate that. And this is one of the really things that long things that kept me in the format for a really long time was people like you. New people to the format who wanted to learn and had a plethora of people who loved the format and loved to meet and welcome new people to the community as well. And that's like that means so much to me, because if you get some enjoyment because of the hard work that our compatriots are doing on the 7-Point Highlander Discord and stuff, if you're getting enjoyment out of it and we made your life a little bit better, then that's like really fantastic news. So thank you so much for saying that. I'll always be on the Discord. Otherwise, thank you so much for listening to this deck philosophy presentation. I really want you to keep an eye out on the 7-Point Highlander website as well. That's 7ph.com.au, because Dan and Drew have been pioneering deck philosophy on that website. They've done some really huge deep dive articles. and they're really fantastic. So if you like deck philosophy, I highly recommend you go and check that out as well. When I win, I'll put a picture of Angus up. Thank you. I appreciate that as well. Things that I like doing, hanging out with my friends, hanging out with my community, things that I really, really, really enjoy doing but take too much time out of my day, is content creation. So that's why you'll see a lot less of me. But fantastic. If you like more deck philosophy, check out 7pointhighlander.com.au for Dan and Drew's articles. If you want to see Drew but not Dan, you can check him on Sunday. He will be competing with his Bauble and Coke that we did a deck tech on. He'll be competing on Sunday as well, so we'll all be rooting for him. And if you want to see more of me in such a wonderful aspect as well, I'll be joining Jimbo on his channel, twitch.tv/epiceki, once again on Sunday at 11 a.m. for the pre-game show. And then we'll be doing some more stuff from there. So thank you very much. Thank you very much to everyone who listened, who stuck towards the end, who listened to me spill my heart out about how much I care about the community. Thank you so much for everything that you do for the Magic community, and I'll see you next time.